We've all had that feeling. The one where you feel like there's this person or a group of people controlling everything that we do like a puppet on a string. You keep seeing certain things exposed and you get the occasional peek behind the curtain, but it's all too difficult to make sense of it, to piece everything together. Well, perhaps they want you to feel that way, and maybe they've been at it for decades. Adam Smith was writing back in the 18th century, and in his work, The Wealth of Nations, pointed out that in England, the most powerful country in his day, the ones who created policy were those who owned the country, which during the Industrial Age were the merchants and manufacturers. He said, "All for ourselves and nothing for other people seems in every age of the world to have been the vile maxim of the masters of mankind." The Industrial Revolution, and the invention of fractional reserve banking, and the scientific and technological advancements during the past 3 decades have all ushered in a new type of wealth and power. The merchants of Adam Smith's day are now a new global elite spread across various networks and industries. We can see the incredible concentration of wealth in a few hands, and this has made it possible to mold the minds of vast populations by applying scientific techniques through the media and by having control of the education system. Adam Smith explicitly said that during war, the manufacturers will have a double demand upon them and be called upon to work up goods. They may flourish amidst the ruin of their country and begin to decay upon the return of its prosperity. In other words, war, conflict, and division pays, and they'll do what they can to make these situations keep going. And these cycles of boom and bust lead to ever-increasing wealth inequality, most notably since the 2008 financial crisis, and more recently since the pandemic started. So how come you're not getting a piece of the pie? How come nothing really changes when you elect a different government? Is this all just a game of distortions? And are we being played? One of the easiest ways to move wealth into your own hands is through the distortion of markets. And we've seen the distortion of markets after panics and crashes and during and after wartime. We've been seeing the concentration of wealth into an ever-decreasing proportion of the population throughout booms and busts. And we're witnessing a huge change in the concentration of power of transnational companies as they merge into fewer corporations and therefore fewer stakeholders' hands. And the people who are at the heart of all this wealth aren't just out for the money. What will it take for people to realise that the wealthiest individuals in the world hold an immense amount of power but were never elected? The same names crop up time and again as funders of institutions, charities, universities, campaigns and societies all around the world. And they all get to sit at the same table and discuss policies, objectives and world vision. There are the oligarchs and uber rich, and then there are the middlemen power brokers made up of businessmen who control the politicians or who used to be politicians and have a network of influence. Because they know that it isn't really the governments who are calling the shots.
This is an exclusive invite-only event where they bring effectively the top movers and shakers, largely in big tech and media, come to this event to network. Think of it as the world's most exclusive networking event.
These executives are encouraged not to talk to people like me. They come here for the opposite reason, to ditch their corporate suits and have some straight talk with their peers. Whatever they're plotting, I certainly don't know what it is yet.
These people that come together are trying to figure out how to come together and do bigger deals and merge and acquire, not be broken up. Likely that'll be on the forefront of minds. They're probably talking about which politicians may need a little extra campaign boost.
This group of people have an aggregate worth of $1 trillion, maybe more. So the things that they're going to talk about and the deals that come out of this, I am sure will ultimately, in the long run, impact all of us.
We're developing a separate class of billionaire kings whose will is omnipotent and untouchable by any democratic force. A continual consolidation of corporations also leads to a consolidation of wealth and power. For example, these 10 corporations control almost everything you buy. And many small banks that operated around the US and the world have now been consolidated. For example, here you can see the evolution of Citigroup, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo. In the US, the 10 largest financial institutions hold 54% of total US financial assets. In 1990, they held 20%, and the number of banks has dropped from more than 12,500 to 8,000. A survey of the Swiss Institute of Tech found that only a handful of financial institutions worldwide hold global corporate control of most corporations in the world. This gives the stakeholders in charge of these corporations huge amounts of power, like JP Morgan Chase, Barclays, Goldman Sachs, and BlackRock, to name a few. The latest iteration of corporate power comes in the form of big tech. Like other powerful companies that have risen over the centuries, they provide something that most of the planet needs and wants, that now people can no longer do without. They're essentially the modern-day merchants. They have the ability to censor particular sides of a debate and change the way we think about anything. When they pool their resources, they're pretty much unstoppable. They have the ability to direct our future. For example, big tech is currently working with the Biden administration to curb misinformation on the internet. It's all becoming a little too like Orwell's book 1984 and its Ministry of Truth, and it's another distortion in our reality. Of course, this is all done under the pretense of protection, that is, for the good of the public. But how did we get to these levels of distrust in the first place? The value we placed in institutions has certainly waned over the years, and some of this is surely to do with the realization that in so many instances over the course of history, we have been duped. We listened, but we were being controlled to think a certain way. Ironically, now we try to make sense of the fact that institutions are not incorruptible and that there may be other sources of information available to us, we are again curtailed in our ability to find the truth. A large part of this comes from another type of corporation which has toyed with our lives for as long as corporations have existed, and that is the media. It's not necessarily the media tycoons themselves who drive an agenda, but it is certainly through the actions of their media that strategies get fulfilled. And certainly they can have sway over what a government or certain politicians do. When you have families that have monopolies over the media in certain countries, you're bound to find plenty of occurrences of spinning a narrative to control the public. And the media have a tried and tested playbook when it comes to making us believe in fairy tales. Watch out for a video on this later. Henry Ford said, "It is well enough that people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system. For if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." Central banks are the engines that drive the world, and many look to the Fed. What's its role in all this? Wealthy bankers effectively drafted what would become the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 to centralize the US money supply. Again, it was about reining in even more control. An exclusive club of bankers met in a secret conference on Jekyll Island in Georgia to discuss the creation of an entity called the National Reserve Association. The conference was held in secret because they thought that the gathering would face public scrutiny and the proposal would be perceived as designed by and for the bankers. To accommodate the various interests of a diverse US, it wasn't made up of a single bank, it was a collection of regional banks. To appease Washington, these regional banks would have a central governing body. Who are the shareholders? Well, pretty much every big bank in America. Operating outside of the constraints of the US government, the privatized Federal Reserve controls the US government's central banking system. The Fed controls the printing of the US's own currency and then charges the US government interest on those loans. The interest is growing each year, making it difficult if not impossible for the government to pay it. Through the Federal Reserve, the bankers could loan money, shape the world landscape, and become one of the most powerful organizations in the world. These factors determine either economic prosperity or the lack thereof. A small monopoly could loan money to the government with interest and had complete control over the creation of American money. Due to fractional reserve lending, banks can also lend out 10 times more money than they actually have in reserve. Debt has now become the backbone of the economy. Mayer Amschel Rothschild, founder of the Rothschild family international banking dynasty, said, "Permit me to issue and control the money of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws." James Garfield said, "Whoever controls the volume of money in our country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. When you realize that the entire system is very easily controlled, one way or another, by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate." By having a large supply of money that has no limitation in how and when it can be fabricated, that level of money can cause distortion and a certain level of deceit. When you aggregate all the numbers between the Fed, the ECB, and the Bank of Japan, the level of money that continues to dump into the system has been going up and up since 2008. And you can see that the US stock market rose exponentially in comparison to other areas of the world. If you simply create money to help the financial system, it's not really capitalism. The money doesn't really go where you need it to go. But the ones benefiting by using the increase in wealth to buy more of the world are either rich individuals or rich investment vehicles. And there's an even more secretive banking institution, dubbed the central bank to the central banks. This is the Bank for International Settlements. It has incredible immunity from virtually all regulation, scrutiny, and accountability. It is privately owned by central banks, most of which are also private. It has sweeping powers to do anything for its own account or for the account of its member central banks. It can also act as an agent for any central bank, enabling central banks to obscure transactions from onlookers. In fact, John Maynard Keynes wanted it closed down as it was used to launder money for the Nazis in World War II. The originators of the bank wanted a new bank that would serve as the world's first international financial institution, a meeting place for central bankers away from the demands of politicians. The bank would bring order and coordination to the world financial system.
There was no need for it to exist after German reparations. It should have been closed down after the Second World War for its collaboration with the Nazis. But it's always reinventing itself, and its latest incarnation is very clever. What they've done is using the bank as a place to host a lot of the new architecture of the global financial system, specifically the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision.
As well as discussing financial operations of the bank, it discusses global monetary policy too. And it's now targeting a global currency. And central banks are also thinking of creating their own digital currencies as well.
When you ask central banks around the world whether they are exploring CBDC, 1 year ago the answer was 80% of them were exploring, and now it's nearly 90%. Last year 40% were experimenting, and now it's 60%. The vast majority of central banks are exploring CBDC.
Should you be worried about how the government can track what you're doing? Well, maybe you should be with a digital currency. Recently, an article in The Telegraph stated that the Bank of England had called on ministers to decide whether a central bank digital currency should be programmable, ultimately giving the issuer control over how it is spent by the recipient. This would mean that there could be some condition on how that money could be spent, that a government or an employer could prevent someone from spending that money on an activity which is seen to be socially harmful in some way. Are we really heading towards such obvious restrictions on our freedoms? In fact, with digital currencies being explored by the likes of big tech as well, we have to ask ourselves just how much control do we want to hand over? The real truth of the matter is, as you and I know, that a financial element in the larger centres has owned the government since the days of Andrew Jackson. Democracy has always been a fragile thing which seems to require constant attention and feeding. But what if it really is just an illusion? It started with taking power away from kings, moving on to taking power away from the classes who thought they were born to rule, to the landowners, colonizers, and we've also seen democracies arise out of power being taken away from despots, dictators, and occupiers. But there's a general feeling, even in modern Western democracies, that there are still problems. Power is much more nuanced and complex. We can no longer point to a group of people at the top of the food chain and say they're controlling all of our decisions or freedoms. There's no king or landowner that directly dictates where we go, how much we get paid, or whether we can exercise certain freedoms like voting or having access to education.
The point I make is that there's been a kind of two-pronged strategy. The first prong has been over the last 40 years, big business has done everything it can to whittle down, push back, force into retreat the social state. Social programs, social government, they push for privatization, they push for deregulation. So they push for a smaller and smaller capacity of the state to actually serve the needs of the people and to regulate them. So on the one hand, they've done that. On the other hand, they've said, and by the way, we're good now, so we can take over those roles that the diminished state used to run. Whether it's schools or water systems or whatever. So that's been the two-pronged attack. So the shrouding themselves in goodness has been very much part of a deliberate strategy to sort of finish the work of taking over everything. And they've done a very good job at it. And I think the point when I realized it, I was shooting with a crew in Davos, Switzerland, at the big sort of Davos World Economic Forum thing in 2018. And I caught a guy named Richard Edelman in the town square, and I had my camera operator, and so we did an interview on the fly. Richard Edelman is like probably the world's most well-known and influential business guru. He's the guy that corporations pay tons of money to explain to them what's happening. And so the way he put it to me is that corporations are good actors now, so they can fill the voids left by retreating governments. Now, of course, the reason governments are retreating is because corporations have pushed them into retreat. They've lobbied, they've influenced, they've done everything they can to drive down taxes, regulation, and all of that. So now that they're in retreat, corporations step in and say, okay, we'll solve the problem. They don't work anymore, so we'll take over. Whatever else you might say about corporations, they're not democratic institutions. And this is what he said to me, and it's a direct quote. It's in the film, it's in the book, and it's chilling. He said, because this is the good guy of corporate capitalism. He said, I'm not much of a believer in political citizenship. I believe in the power of the marketplace. Because now corporations are good, and so political citizenship, not really working. So just let us run things. We'll do it much better and more efficiently.
At the same time, there also appears to be a decline in the power of governments, and people feel alienated from political institutions and from formal democracy. There's clear evidence that biased press coverage can keep voters in the dark and suppress key facts from opposition politicians, often releasing smear campaigns at the same time. They'll convince you to elect politicians with hawkish foreign policy approaches in order to keep the Pentagon's big weapons-making firms in business, for example.
Do you know in 2016, after the shock of Trump's victory, one of the states Trump won that Hillary was expected to win was Wisconsin. So the New York Times actually published a really good article. They went to Milwaukee, which is a heavily African-American city that typically votes overwhelmingly Democrat. And they analyzed the reason Hillary lost Wisconsin was because so many Black voters who had voted in previous elections for Obama stayed at home. And they went and they asked them, knowing now that Trump won, in part because you decided to stay at home, do you regret that choice? And to a person, they all said, absolutely not. I don't regret it in the slightest. In fact, I only voted for Obama kind of out of like racial obligation. He didn't do shit for our lives. And I sure as hell wasn't going to go do that for Hillary. This is like the unspoken fact that just is disappeared because it's such a revealing fact about the two parties. If you only interview and speak to and hear from the people who believe that there are these really radical differences between the parties, that it's a battle between good and evil, if you only hear from them, it'll seem like that's true because you've just excluded everybody else, millions and millions of people, not a tiny fringe, millions and millions of people. who think exactly the opposite. Ultimately, yeah, there are differences between the parties. I mean, you can't deny that there are differences. I mean, they have differences on cultural debates and the like. But on the questions of foreign policy, militarism, capitalism, the working class, there are really no differences at all. They're funded by exactly the same power centers. And, it's become this kind of stigmatized taboo view to talk about the existence of a deep state in the United States, even though there so obviously is one. If you just pick up any book of the Cold War, Devil's Chessboard or the Jakarta Method, there's several really good ones. That whole thing was created on purpose to be a secret power center that exercises dominion and hegemony regardless of the outcome of elections. You can have a Republican, you can have a Democrat, and the CIA gets what they want, the Pentagon gets what they want, the Wall Street gets what it wants, and now increasingly Silicon Valley gets what it wants.
There's been a steady and increased tendency over the last century to cave in to the bankers, the rich, the very well-off political opportunists who tend to consult or people the people at the top of the government. There appears to be a surrender of policy making, often to the editors of newspapers, and a dependence on PR firms to find new initiatives. As we increasingly feel the effects of globalism, the map of political power in any modern democracy now has to include the power of bankers, of international corporations, of money markets, and of supranational bodies like the UN, the World Bank, the WTO, and the WHO. And you can't escape the feeling that it would all be so much easier for those who cling to power and wealth if there was one population to control rather than many fragmented groups. The pillars of what makes up a democracy are slowly being eroded. An independent media, free speech, the right to a private life, a government free from outside influence. And when democracy is eroded, you leave the doorway open to your house being attacked. But if governments are the enabler to gaining a greater level of control on us as a population, they work in consort with other powerful actors who, for whatever reason, have an agenda, a plan, and an outcome for all of us. This all seems to lead to one startling fact. The notion of national sovereignty is a myth.
Ladies and gentlemen, the very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. No president should fear public scrutiny of his program, for from that scrutiny comes understanding, and from that understanding comes support or opposition, and both are necessary. I am not asking your newspapers to support an administration, but I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people.